Here. I thank you for joining me again. I had an interesting experience that I want to relate to you and just add a bit of wisdom, I hope. I, uh, I received a link because of my videos on the departure in Second Thessalonians chapter 1, 2, and 3, and the translation of apostasia in the Greek as departure. I received a link to a video and I clicked on that video and I watched it. And it was a man who believes that the rapture will take place at the end of the tribulation. And so his cohort, if you will, his people that follow him are preparing Christians to survive, if you will, the Great Tribulation. And as I read this, I have to say, it was disturbing to think about it, and also they were reinterpreting verses that I thought, wow, how did they come to that? And so I just want to address this for a moment because what happened is the algorithm on YouTube then, every time I would open up YouTube, it would feed me a whole bunch of videos espousing this same position. And so I was kind of immersed in all of this. And I realized, I said, boy, what's going on here? And I want to just address a couple of issues that came up during my time viewing those videos. One is the misinterpretation of the day of the Lord, or the day of Christ. And what this means, literally, God has always delegated his operation amongst humanity and on the earth. He delegated the care of the Garden of Eden to Adam and Eve and so forth. And we see that right on through. God delegates. And when we see the day of the Lord, he stops delegating and he steps in. And that's the key if you want to understand the day of the Lord or the day of Christ. And that day of Christ then begins with 7 years of tribulation, very well defined by the prophet Daniel, and it's a great time. Jacob's trouble, it's a great time. The wrath of God, not a great time in a good sense, a great time in a terrible sense. It's the wrath of God poured out upon the earth in judgment. And so to see us as a church having to withstand that kind of withering tribulation and problems is definitely a discouragement. And it took me back to our passage in Second Thessalonians where he said, now with regard, brethren, to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together with him or to him, he said that you may not be quickly shaken from your composure or be disturbed either by a spirit or a message or a letter as from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. And so I just want you to enter into the context there in the Thessalonian church. They were disturbed. There were teachers coming in and saying that the day of the Lord was upon them because they were experiencing terrible tribulation. People were being martyred and killed in horrible ways. And so teachers were saying, well, you know, what Paul taught us wasn't exactly correct. We're in the tribulation. And so they were shaken in their composure. And then he says this assertion, it's an assertion, let no one in any way deceive you. So he's saying there are people who are trying to deceive you. For the day of the Lord, this time of the tribulation, will not come unless the apostasia in the Greek comes first. And so he was telling he was assuring, he was comforting. And then he later says, don't you remember that while I was still with you, I was telling you these things, verse 5. And so this context is very, very important. So in the process of listening to these YouTube videos, I came upon a video by Lee Bernard. And Lee Bernard was held up as someone on our side. He believes in a pre-tribulational rapture, but he believes that apostasia here is rebellion as is generally translated in all of the translations that you have access to. And so he was making the case that this apostasia was a spiritual rebellion. And so I listened to it. It's a video that's hard to listen to, I have to say. It goes on for almost an hour, well over an hour. And he is a scholar of first class, and he classical Greek and Koine Greek. And so I listened to him. But here's my critique in case you are faced with this kind of withering scholarship to deny what is, I think, obvious here, and why it's obvious to me. First of all, the failure many times is to look at the word and the word meaning. Do the word study first. I would say the most important thing, aspect of interpretation in determining the meaning of a word is context. The meaning of a word is always determined by the context. And an author, Paul, or me for that matter, can make up a word if we want to. And we give it meaning by the context. And the context will, if it's a strange word, the context will bring out the meaning. And so you'll understand immediately what it is. Then the next most important thing is grammar. And then lastly, the root word of the word, how it's used in classical Greek, or the dictionary meaning, if you will, of the word. And so an author can deviate from the dictionary meaning of a word if he wants to, as long as he can establish in the context the meaning that he's intending to communicate. And so I just want to say that the context here, Paul was talking about our departure in rapture. Does anybody question that? That is the context of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. These are the great passages, besides, of course, 1 Corinthians 15. These are the great passages clearly asserting that we will meet the Lord in the air and therefore be with him. And so when we read this, because he uses now grammar, the definite article. Now here's my Greek grammar. It's the one by Paul Kaufman. He was a great classical Greek scholar. And now it is true that the definite article can be used differently and distinctly in Greek where it isn't used that way in English. So there are differences, but he says here, the article on page 153, point number 5, use of the article. The article is used to make clear a previous reference. Case closed. When you talk about the something, the car, the book, the person you're talking to has to have a previous reference. You've talked about that before. Or the person's going to say, I have no idea what you're talking about. What car? Or what book? No. When you say the apostasia, then you have defined by grammar something that the Thessalonian believers would understand from the context. And the context here is our departure. And so apostasia, you can argue, and this Lee Bernard does, very scholarly, that the word apostasia doesn't generally mean departure. That's irrelevant. The context says that it has to mean departure. Now, we say, well, what if it doesn't? What if all the translations are correct and it means rebellion? The question then you have to ask is, how do you understand this rebellion? And no one, not Lee Bernard, not anyone, has a answer for that question. No one can answer what the rebellion is, because it's a defining marker that must happen before. So this is something very definable, something precise. And so I'm saying that the context and the grammar demands that this be departure, and that departure is a reference to our rapture And so we celebrate each year our pending departure. And the reason I'm I'm hammering on this is I want you to be comfortable. I want you to be convinced. I want it to be clear in your mind what the Bible is saying, because here we have a incidents where we have institutional influence in the translation, and that institutional contamination is what created the translations that you have where it's translated as rebellion. That's an institutional contamination, and I think I may have dealt with that at another time. And so I just want to emphasize this and focus on it. Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the departure comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed. And then I would just close finally. We must understand that there's an indefinite period of time between our departure and the beginning of the tribulation. That indefinite period of time could be weeks, months, maybe even longer. But there's an indefinite period of time. The departure does not trigger the tribulation. There is time that develops in there. Anyway, I just wanted to relate to that because I know some of you are doing exactly as I'm doing. You're clicking on, you're trying to figure out pre-tribulational rapture. Is that correct? Am I to understand it correctly? And what happens when people say that this is a secondary doctrine, I'm sorry, I think Paul thought this was a primary doctrine. Paul addressed this to the Corinthian believers. Paul addressed this very specifically in two epistles, the First Thessalonians epistle and the Second Thessalonian epistle. And so these are very important doctrines or ideas or truths or assertions by the Apostle Paul, notwithstanding Jesus talking about it in John. And so I just wanted to emphasize context, grammar, and then you can have your word study. But the word study is not very important because the context determines the meaning of the word. And I've even made up words in some of my work because I didn't have a word that properly described what I was understanding, so I made a word up. That's my prerogative as the author. And of course you have to make sure that the meaning is clear from the context, because otherwise your audience would be confused. Anyway, I hope this is helpful. I wanted to just help you out, those of you who are like me, watching some of these teachers on YouTube and other channels and so forth, that you may not be soon shaken or quickly shaken from your composure, or be disturbed by a spirit, a message, or a letter as from Paul. And so God bless you, and I hope this has been helpful.